Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, we continue our exploration of Weimar cinema, the outburst of extraordinary creativity in German cinema of the 1920s. Today's subject? Nothing less than another feature of the 1920s, psychoanalysis. We'll be looking at the film Secrets of a Soul by G.W. Pabst, and authorized by a number of members of the psychoanalytic community. Joining us to discuss this fascinating film is my colleague Andreas Killen from the City College of New York, a noted expert on Germany, science, and the representation of psychology. Now, enter the mind of someone in Secrets of a Soul. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed that last visit to an alpine setting with a very, very happy family. It's quite a journey through the 75 minutes of that film, and it says a lot about Weimar cinema and a lot about psychoanalysis in that particular moment. It's a pleasure to have with us here one of my colleagues from the City College, Professor Andreas Killen, who's also professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's a historian of modern science, and particularly modern science as it's been filtered through German culture. In fact, among his many publications is Homo Cinematicus, which specifically talks about this intersection between German culture, notably during the Weimar era, as elsewhere, science and psychoanalysis and cinema. Welcome to City Cinematheque, Andreas.
Thank you, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So let's just begin with the kind of broad lens view of this, how shall I put it, this conversation between and about cinema and science and psychology that's taking place in the 1920s. What's that about?
Well, yeah, what is it about? It is, in fact, a very vibrant conversation that plays itself out during the whole Weimar period. The film Secrets of the Soul itself is it's a story of a man who suffers a psychological crisis and undergoes treatment at the hands of a psychoanalyst. And in order to understand, the reasons behind the making of the film, I think it's worth saying a little bit about the context that you just alluded to. So this film was released in 1926 in the middle of the so-called Weimar era, which was a period of tremendous cultural ferment and experimentation that was very much marked by the legacy of the First World War.
Right.
And as well as the political and economic aftershocks of the war. And one of the central features of the legacy of the war was the experience of shell shock, precursor to today's PTSD. This was not simply a kind of minor chapter in the history of the war. It was, in many ways, a kind of mass experience. The German army alone, it's estimated, saw something like 600,000 plus cases of men suffering from the effects of war-related psychological trauma. So it happened on an epidemic scale.
Wow.
And this necessitated, on the part of the state and the German high command, intensive efforts to find ways of treating these men. And so there was a quite enormous medical campaign led by psychiatrists, by neurologists, and by psychoanalysts to find ways of treating men and getting them back on their feet. And in the aftermath of the war, this experience, the experience of shell shock and the prominence of doctors of the mind in the experience of grappling with shell shock led to a kind of cultural fascination with psychological themes and with these doctors of the mind. And you can find many examples of this in the cinema of the Weimar period. I know you've already discussed Caligari here. That's one example of this. the Mabuse films. There are many other such examples. Right. And in many cases, these films feature doctors of the mind, whether they're psychiatrists or neurologists or hypnotists or psychoanalysts, in very ambivalent ways.
Okay.
And so that's part of the context in which I think we have to place this film, Secrets of the Soul.
Okay. So let's now talk about the creation of this film, because I think you just delineated the fact that these doctors of the mind can come in any number of ways, and psychoanalysts are only kind of one of them, and they're coming into public prominence, but there's competing models, okay, and there's this whole question, raised of this is claimed to be science, but is it really is science? On the one hand, and on the other hand, there's this question of, to what degree, if we're scientists, do we have to engage to self-justify ourselves in our own self-interest, or to what degree should we just be scientists and they should understand that? So what's some of the background on the making of the film, and who will participate, who won't participate? Right.
Well, this was a fairly significant project. It was produced by UFA, which was the dominant film production company in Germany during the Weimar years. It was directed by G.W. Pabst, who had come to prominence with his earlier film Joyless Streets, and would go on to make films like Pandora's Box and Threepenny Opera. Pabst was incidentally the guy who discovered Greta Garbo and Louise Brooks.
Right.
Incidentally, also, he is the subject of a new novel by the German author Daniel Killen. The novel is called The Director. It just came out quite recently.
So he has an enduring cultural impact.
He is an enduring figure,
right.
Yes, of this moment. And it also featured, the lead part is played by the actor Werner Krauss, who played
Caligari.
Who played Caligari in the earlier film. Employed as consultants two members of Berlin's psychoanalytic community. These two people were Karl Abraham and Hans Sachs, significant figures in their own right. The film had the participation of these two men came about as a result of somewhat complicated discussions within the world of psychoanalysis. Freud himself had enormous reservations about the project.
Okay.
He felt that any attempt to depict, he was in some sense fairly conservative when it came to the medium of the mass medium of film, and he felt that any attempt to depict psychoanalytic themes on screen would hopelessly vulgarize his young science. Abraham and Sachs argued that their participation would ensure that psychoanalysis received a fair, sober treatment, and that, moreover, that this was important in order precisely to rescue psychoanalysis from the kind of negative portrayals that it had received in the film, especially in the film Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, which had come out the year before.
Okay, so before we get into the film itself, it's worth I think exploring what happens afterwards. I mean, that is what has been, and it doesn't have to be a single thing. What have been some of the aspects of the psychoanalytic community's response, because it is a film that has been made and circulated now for almost 100 years.
Right. Well, this was the very first film to portray psychoanalysis on film. By no means the last. I mean, you can name. Many of the films of Hitchcock are unthinkable without taking into account the influence of psychoanalysis. So it spawns a whole interest that in many ways you can trace all through the history of cinema since that moment right up to the present.
So it's a generative text in that way.
In many ways, it's quite generative.
Yeah.
And it does seem to have reached a wide audience and to have gone some way to establishing the claims to legitimacy of psychoanalysis as a science for treating troubled souls.
Okay, so let me then put this film in the context of something you and I had discussed at another time, and that is the whole way in which cinema is to be used to represent science, psychology, and in this particular instance, psychoanalysis. You know, cinema is a plastic medium, like all artistic media, that can be actually be organized or patterned in all kinds of different ways. Right. So where do you see, I mean, this is a film that has a, very significant actor like Werner Krauss. Mm-hmm. By the way, for those people who've seen The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, I think it's very interesting simply to note that his is an expressionist performance to the T in Caligari, completely unnaturalistic, and in this film he goes 180 degrees away, including the use of the highly naturalistic close-ups of what can he micro-express through a genuine human space. So you're talking about a significant actor here.
Right. Right.
Yeah, but to come back, let's just talk about how. What kind of film this is, aside from the fact that it's a film about psychoanalysis? Well,
film, the history of film, there's in some sense a kind of parallel history of film. There's the history of film as a medium of entertainment,
right.
mass entertainment. But from the very beginning, film was used for scientific purposes. It was used to study phenomena that escaped, that escaped the naked eye, to using close-ups and slow motion and so forth. It could isolate, it could draw out certain features of natural processes that were otherwise hard to detect by scientists. And so it had established itself well before this film was made as a very important instrument within the tools used by scientists to both to produce scientific knowledge and then to communicate about it and to educate the wider public about their findings. And that's, in a sense, exactly what is going on with this film. This film is, in some sense, a hybrid because it yokes the conventions of a feature film to those of a somewhat more educational, didactic film in order to communicate scientific themes.
Yeah, let me just add to that, and there's a way in which there is a didactic structure that is blended, I think, in this film rather seamlessly, with a traditional dramatic structure, and that is you have a setup. And then at a certain point, the world has become destabilized, okay? And we know this from action pictures. I mean, that's, when the bank robbery goes bad and civilians are killed, and then you got to track everybody down, okay? Stable bank robbery, blah, blah, blah. But here, we have that same narrative, in fact, Aristotelian kind of pattern, but the person who shows up, the detective, as it was, just happens to be Dr. Orth,
Yes.
And then he takes on this role at this particular moment.
So there's a subplot involving a murder that sort of plays in the background, partly as a way, I think, of moving the plot along, but partly as a way of sort of this helping the film establish a contact with its popular audience.
Right.
In any case, so the story again is about a man, a scientist, who suffers a crisis, and this man is happily married, although the marriage is childless.
Right.
That's a crucial point, and the crisis is precipitated when by the return from abroad of a man who is both his best friend and his wife's cousin. And this man is an explorer. He's spent, preceding years in Sumatra, and he finally returns. And there's a reunion. And that evening, as they're standing around, they're looking at a photograph.
Right.
And the photograph depicts the three of them as children. Standing in a room surrounded by toys, a rocking horse, toy trains, and so forth. And the sight of this photograph triggers a very uneasy memory in the man, the central protagonist of the film, who that night falls asleep and has a lengthy dream.
And by the way, by lengthy dream, I just want to say that it runs 5 or 6 minutes.
7.5.
Okay, thank you.
A 7.5 minute long dream sequence, which is highly cinematic. I mean, it uses all the tricks of the trade: stop motion, dissolve, superimpositions, montage, the works. To go back to your reference to expressionism, I mean, I think you can even find traces of sort of earlier styles within the way in which the dream sequence is portrayed. In any case, yes, it's a very extended and quite fascinating dream sequence that seems to point to feelings of insecurity and rivalry between the scientist, between the man and his friend who has returned, vis-a-vis the man's wife.
Right, right.
The dream culminates with the man seizing a sword and stabbing the ghostly apparition of his wife.
Right.
And this is what precipitates the crisis. And so he then seeks the help of a psychoanalyst.
Right.
And with the aid of the gentle coaxing of this psychoanalyst, he is led through a process of dream interpretation, which again seems to confirm the existence of feelings of inadequacy and rivalry vis-a-vis the friend who has returned. And as always happens in a psychoanalytic treatment, the interpretation of the dream leads back to childhood memories.
Okay, right.
And the specific childhood memory that it leads to is actually, the scene that was captured in the photograph that we saw them looking at earlier.
But we saw it briefly, and we saw his reticence, and we saw him putting it in the stack, and now all of a sudden it's expanding outward.
Yes.
Yeah.
But now the recovery of the dream is no longer treated photographically; it's treated cinematically.
Okay.
So memory is no longer photographic; it's cinematic. And in this way, the film Secrets of the Soul, I think, affirms the superior truth value of cinema as a means of accessing memory, as a means of accessing the psychic interior. And again, what the recovery of the memory, which places them, which I mean, he's reminded that the scene of them standing amidst all these toys took place in a photographer's studio,
Right.
in which he first experienced the consciousness of this feeling of rivalry between him and his friend. Right. And it's the recovery of that memory, which again has been now portrayed cinematically, that frees him from this kind of childhood trauma, if you will, that has haunted him. And once he is freed from that, he's able to return to his wife, and they are able to consummate their love and have a child, and that's what is depicted in the final scene.
Right.
And so I mean, I think the film concludes by suggesting in a very direct way that psychoanalysis and cinema share a certain kinship in the way that they are both tools for or means of accessing psychic reality.
Okay, so I want to take that just a step further, which has to do with the fact that not all of these images of the past in the film are filmed in the same way. And this only underlines the point you made earlier, that the full cinematic toolkit is really being used here. So his initial dream, which is a nightmare, is an involuntary act.
Right.
and there's these extraordinary images, I mean, of him flying through the air, of him falling, onto what looks like a chessboard,
A tower with a spiral staircase.
Tower with the spiraling. Oh, and I wonder if Hitchcock saw that. Or with his favorite films of James Stewart, Secrets of the Soul. And that. But then, when, for example, he, as they say, months later, and that's very interesting that they're actually talking about the fact that that psychoanalysis is not a 2 or 3 session thing, but when it says months later, and he's beginning to pull these memories, or they're beginning to appear, we repeat the scenes, but they're filmed in a different style.
Right.
And so it's signifying this different relationship with the interiority that it's actually coming through. And then the final scene, which is a memory sequence, is done in, and I mean this positively, in a certain sense, in a very traditional manner, in the sense that it is like the contemporary reality. He's really reliving that scene itself, and so
and reenacting it
absolutely
in his waking state.
Absolutely the case. Demonstrating the power of cinema to not merely capture material reality or recreate it in some way, but it has this capacity to express different levels of consciousness and of mental and of mental activity.
Exactly, it's a very, very layered process. As the man, again, under the gentle prodding of the doctor, is led deeper and deeper into the meanings of the dream and into his own psyche, into his own memory.
Right. And of course, one of the things is, when we first see that photo, all we see is the 3 of them. But by the time we get to the full memory of the session, all of a sudden there are all kinds of motifs. I mean, the baby doll, obviously, and most clearly, but in the dream sequence, you're going, well, wait a minute. There's this huge representation of trains here. Yeah. Okay, so the cousin is coming on a train. Okay, but then all of a sudden, when you get to this, you understand that in the design of the film and its appreciation of psychoanalysis, that all of a sudden you have all the mechanical trains that are in the childhood setting. So, pulling all of these things together using cinematic style and mise-en-scène and editing to do so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, so the full recovery of the meaning of the dream, which culminates in the scene in the photographer's studio where, the first glimmerings of the sort of tension that will plague this man throughout his adult life are made evident. That recovery is then reenacted in the analyst's office in a moment in which the man leaps off the couch on which he's been lying and grabs, I think it's a letter opener, and in a kind of almost fugue state, repeats the stabbing motion that he had made in the film at the end of the dream that he first experienced when his friend returned. And it is that moment that he's kind of released from this trauma.
And again, speaking of it as not only psychoanalytic design, but as cinematic design, the motif of knives and knives of, how shall I put it, of different function and cultural significance are woven throughout the film. So it's, we have dinner knives, we have the Sumatra sword, but also we have the hesitation in front of opening a letter much earlier. So this visual weaving of motifs is extraordinarily, I'll use the word, well plotted, both in the dramatic sense and in the psychoanalytic sense of making sense of what it is. And of course, Dr. Orth says at that moment, "Do you notice what's in your hand?"
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think it's worth reiterating the point that when he recovers the memory that lies behind the photograph, that is to say, the memory that took place in the photographer's studio in which this little childhood drama was acted out, the photographer who took the photograph is depicted in a way that shows both his face and then the back of his head in a mirror. And so you made very conscious of the fact that cinema is making a claim against photography as a kind of superior means of capturing the truth of memory and of psychic life.
Okay. Well, I think we're gonna end on that moment of the truth of cinema versus photography. You know, in a film, you know, that captures so much about the debate about psychology, science, and cinema of the 1920s. So, if you've liked what we've just explored here, and you'd like to hear more about Weimar cinema, or more generally about the history of cinema, please come back to City Cinematheque. And how would you find out what we're doing in the future? There's an easy way. You go to the website for CUNY TV. It's www.tv.cuny.edu. There you're going to find information about City Cinematheque, how you can communicate with us. We look forward to your comments, and all the other programming here on CUNY TV. But maybe you're not always in New York. Maybe you're not always in front of your television. How could you see all of this stuff? We have a new way, and that's our app. There is a CUNY TV app. So if you visit our website, www.tv.cuny.edu, you'll find out how you can download the CUNY TV app. So, Andreas, thank you so much for bringing a wealth of knowledge and years of your research on these matters to us today. It was a pleasure chatting with you about this fascinating film.
Likewise, it was an absolute pleasure, Terry. Thank you.
Great. And thank you for joining us here on City Cinematheque. We hope you join us again as we continue our stroll through the archives of film history. Bye for now.